Arthur, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation for one of the Future Social Service Institute's newsletters.
Thanks, Micaela. Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat.
Arthur, you have been the Victorian Disability Services Commissioner from 2018 until very recently.
That's right, yes. I was appointed, I think, in about August 2018, and I finished my term in the end of June, 30th of June this year, so just very recently, and it was a great privilege to have that role for that time that I did.
Arthur, I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the people that are our stakeholders and the sector to thank you for your leadership in that role. You've been an incredibly approachable, knowledgeable and compassionate Commissioner, I think. So you've had a really significant role, leadership in government in the transition to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. You're in DPC for that, in the implementation of the new Disability Act in 2016. So you've had a significant leadership experience both in the public service, predominantly in disability, I think, yes?
Predominantly in disability. I did some work as the Director of Housing, so social and public housing in Victoria for a few years, combined with some other things. So, but I say predominantly, probably 80% of my time in the public service was in fact in disability and related disability issues, including the NDIS transition.
So that's a wealth of knowledge to bring to this role, and I'm sure to continue in other contributions that you will be making in public life when you get through this transition bit. Arthur, that's actually what I'm really interested in talking to you about, is your leadership experience through transformational times. And we are experiencing quite an extraordinary transformational time. We've had the bushfires that people talked about being generationally different than we've experienced before, and the impact of that on climate change at the beginning of this year. And now we've got the pandemic. So I'm curious about, as a leader through those times, what you've learned in terms of reflecting on that.
When I reflect on my career, particularly in disability, and before I focused on disability, I was a generalist regional director in DHS or DHHS at different times, different names, which was broadly around health and human services. I came to disability having some knowledge of it, but I guess the first thing I learned was about the most important lessons you can learn and the most important evidence you can get is actually for listening to people with lived experience. You've got to balance, there's some good research, there's some great academic work, people with experience, but you can do no better than listen to people with that lived experience and what it's important in their lives. And one of the people I first met was a woman named Ethel Temby, who has since passed away, but she was a great fighter around closing and improving institutions, and she gave lots of speeches and she wrote some academic works and other works. And the thing that I listened to mostly from her was about the sort of relationship between people with disability and their families and policymakers and health professionals and other professionals. And I remember Ethel, and I've read it since, talking about when her son was born, about how the doctor and the paediatrician came and said to Ethel, the best thing you can do is put your son in Kew Cottages, leave him there and never visit him again and forget him. And Ethel didn't do that. She fought long and hard around that, and her son flourished outside institutions. And she fought long and hard around advocacy and self-advocacy. And that personal story of hers, the same as the personal story of lots of people with a disability who lived in institutions who basically got out, and they would say escaped, and live independent in their lives, as well as some of the great advocates and self-advocates who are more contemporary, and they've lived their lives independently most of their lives. So I think basically the best policy leadership sometimes about following, and in disability is actually about listening to people about what's important for them. And as a policy maker, basically giving up some of the power and making sure that people with a disability and their families can make their own choices and their own decisions about how they want to live their lives. And whilst you can create an enabling environment for that, a policy environment, your work really is to make sure that people with a disability have the agency and the power to make decisions for themselves and families too. And that's why it's so important. The National Disability Insurance Scheme has that built into it. And when we see that mature into a scheme that we all want it to be, I think hopefully people will still see that they've got that power to make their own choices and control their own lives. So for me, that was a really powerful decision. And how you get the balance between listening to people about their own experiences and learning from them, you combine that with some of the policy knowledge that you've got, as well as the academic and other evidence. So that for me was one of the really early lessons, and I didn't get it, to be honest, until I started working closely in disability. And I met some people who've got some very powerful stories, and their stories are much more powerful than anything I can say about disability issues. So that for me was a big issue. I also thought, though, at the same time, as a policy maker, you've got to think about what you do. You do need to have some input to, and what you do need to sort of provide some of your own agency to. And one of the things around me is pretty basic. It's about workforce. For lots of people with a disability, their worker or workers are the people they mostly interact with all their lives. And even if people are living independently, they still have a lot of interaction with their workers. So the quality of the workforce, for me, is a really basic, important point for disability and other human services policy, particularly with disability, because it's not episodic. It's about a lifelong journey for people. It's about their daily lives. And so that around getting the training and support and recruitment of people with the right skills, and that's important that they have got the skills and knowledge to do the work. It's quite complex works at times, and sometimes it's not as complex, but sometimes it is. It's also about values and creating respectful cultures in organisations. And so for me, it sort of starts with the quality of the staff and their support and their training and their development and the professionalisation of disability staff, in a sense about actually taking pride in their role. That for me is a really important matter, and I think we've got some way to go on that still. But I think, we've got to make sure that it's not a market-driven system, that where policy leaders they put input into making sure that agencies who provide these services can have the staff that they need. They've got the time for training, support, professional development, reflection on practice and other things. So for me, that's pretty important too. And I think in terms of staffing and issues, when the staff of the Disability Services Commissioner did a piece of work about building safe and respectful cultures, it's all about that. It's actually about creating the space for respectful conversations and reflections around what's going well and not going well. And now, one of the things I saw in that research was people face lots of small indignities in their life that just get passed by. It's those if you let small indignities go by, they can lead to bigger problems. And so for me, that's a really important lesson about how you focus on that really basic interaction and your staffing at the front end of the service, which for some people is actually what mostly they experience in their lives. And I guess the last thing was, we saw this through the development of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. You can't, in this system, I don't think, let the market drive totally around what things happen. So I think it's important to have a really rigorous and comprehensive quality and safeguards process in place of oversight, because I think people are vulnerable. Can be vulnerable in vulnerable situations. They're not always vulnerable. They're placed in vulnerable situations where they're by themselves with workers. And I think you do need good oversight for that system. But overall, I think you need to make enough space so a person can make some choices for themselves in their lives. And, we all take for granted we've got some agency about our lives. We've all got limitations, but we make choices. And we've got to, I think, create an environment where people can make those choices as well. So there's some of the things for me. I just gloss over a little bit. I think it's important that we continue to think about the importance of advocacy and self-advocacy and making sure that's resourced and supported and empowered to be helpful to people, because some people do need help to advocate for themselves and some people just need advocates because that's what they need. And I think that's really important too. And there's been some great advocates and self-advocates I've worked with in the last 20 years who've made such a big difference and made such a big contribution. So that's sort of my summary about leadership.
Arthur, that's an incredibly rich reflection on a whole range of issues that I would really love to spend more time talking to you about. There's a couple of things that really stand out for me in thinking about what you've just talked about. Given the point of time we're in at the moment, given just how difficult the restrictions are for everybody, but the impact that that has, as you say, on people whose interactions are already, limited in their choices by the system and the way we operate, what do you think are the key things to focus on?
Well, I guess just firstly, I acknowledge it's challenging times for everybody. The isolation that we're all facing and the limitations on our daily lives, which are of course necessary. But recognising that some people with a disability living in residential care have been in lockdown now for months. In fact, they've been quite limited in their community interaction, and some of them, would have gone out for day activities and other things that hasn't happened. So they've been more and more within the home that they're living in. And I guess the take I think on that is that one of the lessons I probably also learned was where things are less visible and lights are not shone on them, it's more likely that things will happen that shouldn't happen. And you'd hope when people are in, quiet, less visible situations, that better things would happen for people because you recognise that's an issue. But unfortunately, we've seen time and time again, less visible, darker places, bad things can happen. So I'm hoping that, we can make sure that people who are isolated are not less visible, that they've got other people in their lives and some way we can connect with them so that they're not reliant only on one worker, one agency for everything, because that's where you can see things happen and they don't get noticed, as we've seen recently and other times. They don't get noticed or bad things happen. So for me, it's a bit about how we can actually create less closed environments in these difficult times. The other thing for me is getting back to workforce. It's been an incredibly difficult time for disability workers. They've got their own home, other situations, and they've got their work situations. And, I think, unfortunately, the disability side of all this have been somewhat more neglected than, say, other more visible workforce areas. I'm not saying they shouldn't have been, like aged care, but, I don't think we've seen the same attention to disability, which is quite a complex and difficult area as well. So I'm hoping, we'll continue to see some support for the workforce, but also some interventions where people don't live such invisible lives that they don't get the support that they need. So that would be, my take on that. Of course, there's all those other things around actually how you help people in isolation and connectivity. For some people with a disability, they don't connect through social media and other things. So it's about how you think about that, and also support that the agencies, I think, have been doing a great job in supporting people with a disability. So I just think it's been an area that's sort of not been quite as high a profile as it needed to have in these difficult times.
Arthur, I think that's incredibly wise advice for people to be keeping in mind. I think you're spot on. Where there is not a light on something, I've spent a lot of my career working in child protection and have a very similar perspective on the risks associated with people where there isn't visibility. There aren't other people coming in and checking in on it. And I think that there is a lot of concern about what will emerge as we kind of emerge out of the restrictions, and we need to be thinking about that now. So,
yeah, I was listening to a podcast the other day with an English poet, and he was spent all his early years in the out-of-home care system in England. And I don't know the exact words, but something to the extent that they did things to me and put me in places because they could. No one else was watching. And, this is where that's again, you get back to the quality of the systems and the safeguards and the checks and balances and the quality of staff. But it's also about the quality of the policy makers. And so it's important, I think, that we raise to the challenge. And the other thing I guess I've learned over time is you've got to be persistent. Things take some time. Now, we saw such a great reform with the NDIS, and that happened relatively quickly, but it's still happening. It's actually not finished yet. So, it's about persistency and making sure that you keep an eye on. You keep an eye on, you're persistent in your pursuit of what you need to do.
And one of the things, Arthur, I have really noticed about the disability sector is the persistence of the advocates. And there are a lot of people who have been persisting passionately for a very long time. And I think you're right, it's not over, and this will see a whole range of changes happening. The last thing I want to kind of reflect back on is what you've said about helping people have pride in their work, a workforce that is proud of the work that they do. A lot of the disability workers I've met, and because of it, Fizzy, we've interact with students, people who come back to learn, they are very proud. They are doing very important work. We've all got a role to play in supporting that.
I completely agree with you on both those things about advocates. I'm more proud of them because they're very important parts of what we do, and so are the workers. And it probably reflects a little bit about disability and community. It is actually really incredibly important work, and people with disability need support to live the lives that we all take for granted. And most of them do a wonderful job without lots of recognition.
That's true. Thank you so much, Arthur. I've really enjoyed catching up with you this morning.
Thanks for the chance to have a chat, Micaela. Thank you.
Thanks.